Brian Frosh. He is one of the two attorneys generals who filed the Emoluments Clause lawsuit. Mr. Frosh, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, I should say. Let me ask you this. I understand how Maryland has standing for this. Explain to me how Washington, D.C. has standing in this if they're collecting D.C. You know, the Trump Hotel is in the district, so they are certainly not being penalized in getting taxes and things like that.
Well, look, D.C. not only has governmental entities that suffer from competition by the Trump Post Office Hotel, like the Convention Center, but it also has many other businesses that suffer from the Trump Hotel's competition, restaurants, hotels, etc. That's how they have standing. So
obviously there's a story today about how Saudi lobbyists purchased hotel rooms for lobbying purposes in order to recruit veterans to help them lobby against a bill they didn't like in Congress. If Americans are representing the Saudis, does that fall under the Emoluments Clause? If it's an American lobbying organization, I'm just curious legally, where would you be able to make that case that that's a violation of the Emoluments Clause if it's an American entity purchasing the room?
You mean because the money's been laundered before it gets to the Trump Post Office Hotel?
That's your word, not mine. But I guess that would be the argument you would make, right?
Yeah, I don't think that works as a defense. But there have been many direct payments. Whether or not those payments, the payments from the lobbying firm on behalf of the Saudis to the Trump Post Office Hotel qualify or not. We've seen repeated examples of direct payments through the Post Office Hotel from foreign governments and from state governments. The state of Maine brought a delegation down here. The United States government has paid money to the Trump Post Office Hotel, and all of those are emoluments within the meaning of the Constitution.
Explain. Well, let me walk you there. You said the state of Maine. They fall under the Emoluments Clause? I thought it was only supposed to be foreign money.
They do. There are two emoluments clauses. The first is the Foreign Emoluments Clause that says that the president may not receive any present or any emolument of any kind whatever from a foreign state. The Domestic Emoluments Clause says that the president gets only his salary and may not receive any other emolument from the United States or any of them, any other state. So when he receives payments from the United States above and beyond his salary, or when he receives a payment from another state, those are both violations of the Domestic Emoluments Clause.
What constitutes a payment to him if he is currently not running the Trump Organization?
Well, if he receives any gain, profit, or advantage from the payment, that's a violation of the Emoluments Clause. Look, what the clauses were designed to do was to show that, to make clear that the president must put the interest of all other Americans above his own. We ought to be able to know when the president is governing and acting in his executive capacity that he's not thinking about his own financial interests, that he's not thinking about himself, and that's why these payments are barred. The framers didn't want him to be under the influence of a foreign state or use the United States government as his ATM.
What does relief look like for the state of Maryland? So a judge, let's say you win your lawsuit. They're going to outline what they believe will be relief here. What will that look like in your best case scenario?
The judge will enjoin President Trump from receiving any further payments from foreign governments, from the United States other than his salary, and from any other states.
How would they enforce that?
Well, that's up to the court to figure out, but it should be self-enforcing. Once a judge issues an order and says to the president, don't do it, he risks being held in contempt of court, and there are other sanctions that could be applied as well.
The reason I ask this is because it is not clear to me how you police and enforce the Emoluments Clause. Obviously, a lawsuit is one way, but let's say you get your relief. He has said he's donating all of his foreign profits, and they sent to the federal treasury. So he gave some $150,000, I think, is what they claimed was foreign profits off of the hotel to the federal treasury. Whose job would it be to double check that?
So the issue is not what his profits are. He's not allowed to receive any payments, period. So he's trying to negotiate the terms of the emoluments clauses, but the United States Constitution is not negotiable. Just the fact that he receives a payment is a violation of the emoluments clauses. It doesn't matter whether he's making money or losing money. If he's getting money from Saudi Arabia, he's violating the Constitution.
So if you get this relief, and that means you need to get him to go to the blind trust. I mean, is that, one would assume that's about I mean, if the court is going to order this, they got to come up with a way to do it. Is that the expectation?
Well, I mean, it's going to be up to the court and up to Trump. I mean, there are lots of ways that he can avoid violating the emoluments clauses. He can sell the Trump Post Office Hotel and his other properties, though they're not at issue in our lawsuit. He can give them away. I'm not sure that a blind trust in these cases would be sufficient because he knows what's in the trust. It's the lease from the Trump Post Office Hotel, or it's the ownership of Mar-a-Lago, or one of his hotels or condominiums in New York. It may be difficult for him, but this is what he signed up for when he ran for president.
How much do you need his tax returns, or is his financial disclosure form, for instance, enough? I say this because through his financial disclosure, we learned, for instance, that they started a new LLC where he earned some $100,000 just selling Trump 2020 T-shirts and other Trump paraphernalia. Number one, would that be a violation of the emoluments clause?
Well, him profiteering off the office of president is repugnant, but not necessarily a violation of the emoluments clauses, unless he's getting paid by a foreign government, a state government, or the United States government, may not violate the emoluments clauses. It's easy for him to stop that kind of conduct. It's really disrespectful, I think, of the office, but not necessarily a constitutional violation. All
right, you're subpoenaing, I think, 5 different federal agencies. You talked about the state of Maine, 13 different organizations. Are they cooperating at this point?
Well, the subpoenas have only just been served. We'll know in a matter of weeks whether or not folks are going to cooperate. And I believe because we're subpoenaing a number of different entities and agencies that will have various degrees of cooperation. Some folks will be cooperative and some will fight us.
Just one of many different areas where the president's personal finances are coming under scrutiny. Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosh, Democrat from Maryland, thanks for coming on, sharing your views. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.